Hello everyone, today we talk about Communal Europe, expanding essentially on those videos we already made on communal civilization and the impact that it had in the Middle Ages, right? We started from this usually critical base and saying, popular culture, we don't give a damn essentially about the communes, about the city-state, about the republics, if you want, but properly on the urban dimension. And we think the Middle Ages is just castles and countryside, and what it just takes banally to just Google when the amount of pictures you can find in castles or knights or some of the most emblematic figures in the images in the Middle Ages, and then try to Google communes, city-states, always about the Middle Ages, and essentially you will get a bunch of photos, mostly from essentially modern Central European half-timbered style, we can say, because that's what our image has from. It was an antiquarian taste of a certain part of our, I think, in fact, of Europe in certain specific centuries that began to portray that those relics, in fact, of a much more recent past, thinking ideally about the Middle Ages, and we have embraced in many ways in the Neo-Gothic, in the Romantic, in the new medieval, style, the idea that that's fundamentally the Middle Ages, and that's how we have interiorized it, and it's still a narrow, even part of the broader idea we have of the Middle Ages, and we leave out dramatically, and this is a very serious business, and it tells a lot about how few actually popular culture knows about the Middle Ages and its single most important elements, right? This is not a matter of perspective, or it's a matter of perspective indeed, the way it happens, but about properly communal civilization and the idea of the city, its role, its institutions, its politics, its society, right? And I will not be explaining today because, frankly, it's not the topic of today's video. But there are evidently many reasons that are ugly ones, actually, for why we have erased the memory of one of the single most important aspects of medieval civilization, and probably also just for the intensity of its achievements, of its, political, institutional, administrative, juridical, artistical, economical, even military advancements should be like on the fore, without any option in our view of the Middle Ages, and instead we have somewhat put aside, right? And explaining the reasons is actually interesting from a historiographical point of view, because we can't blame just a certain perspective of the Middle Ages come from certain very specific countries in Europe to have eventually taken over most of popular in the masses as a popular view of the Middle Ages. We blame also those countries that actually were at the center of it, and that in a way either misinterpreted those phases, or at least wanted to attach maybe certain national aspects to it, and have forgotten for other times still the developments of that communal culture, right? And it's a serious problem that I don't think it's gonna be surpassed unless we don't start taking up seriously medieval history books and starting to understand the deeper importance of certain phenomena. I have been reading in the last years actually a lot of manuals coming from different areas of Europe, which is important for what I'm doing on Schwerpunkt, because I want really to understand what I can do to put out a kind of a balanced picture of medieval history. Because don't think that even today we teach history in the West in a way that it's properly positive in the sense of not just of actual results in terms of people's education, which unfortunately are very low in general, but more specifically for properly the historical view that what we give to this past of medieval history mostly concentrated in Europe, from the Western perspective, and we tend naturally to make a good job overall. We do have the best historiographies, but still it seems to me that there is an enormous divide between perspectives that makes us lack the realization that there was something. In fact, we can't talk about in objective terms, giving the right dimension to it, and that still we don't do. And the reason why we don't do that is essentially that we don't read each other's works, right? This is very serious, because actually, for whoever is acquainted to like at least a master, maybe I can't even talk about this degrees in the university or academic path, but whoever has a serious understanding of medieval historiography in terms of how it has evolved over time, let's say modern historiography on the Middle Ages, better. The terrifying, I would say, amount of works that have been written on it, and the terrifying amount of schools and and questions and problems and sheer volume of pages that exist on at a certain level of detail, that this is probably the most difficult thing to make people understand, right, out there, right, to create that popular awareness that can bring to to society, to press society to realize that it's incredible at the level of ignorance in certain topics, the level of unawareness, like the fact that we don't even know that it exists, right? Believe me, I've been looking at Facebook groups, medieval history groups on Facebook, for example, tons of them, and if you look at, we could even make a video about that, the average stuff that is posted in there, you realize that even people that are allegedly passionate about the Middle Ages, etc., have literally no idea whatsoever of what medieval history, right, not medieval reality, but medieval history, that is how much we have studied these things and how much we know, right, and how much we can't solidly quantify certain aspects there is out there. That is what is taken away from the mass, from the public, right? And there is no conspiracy about it. It's simply explainable after all. But at the same time, it's a disconcerting acknowledgement of how few, or better, how we know nothing, generally speaking, as broader societies, as countries, as mass societies, on our own history, right? And not for like identity reasons or political reasons whatsoever. This is in terms of literally not knowing at all where you come from on a regular basis, and still, however, displaying this interest in history that is at least promising in some way, because it shows that after all there is something about this period that fascinates, right? But it tends to happen in the wrong way, in fact, that people are very easily prey of political reasons for actually getting passionate about very specific topics that once again are extremely narrow in time and especially in space, and that basically blurry and not obscure the awareness of the whole picture, without which even what you study basically has no sense, right? I'm deeply disappointed to see how even on Schwerpunkt, the videos that get more videos are fundamentally the ones about like if they talk about a single people, right? And I get quite clearly the understanding compared to other videos that sometimes and those are usually more generalistic ones compared to some that are more advanced, more insightful, and more researched, about the fact that most of the reason why people come to watch those videos is because of nationality. And let's be honest about that. That one of the greatest catalysts in the historical interest that sucks people in, even sometimes for the better, because eventually these people maybe even grow from that. But it's strictly speaking ethno-nationalistic reasons, right? I studied the Middle Ages because I think that, that my ancestors in my own country in the Middle Ages, there were only those ones, like there couldn't be other people from other countries because who knows why, were like the coolest people on earth, and everything was cool, and then there was this ethics that was so warlike, and I like it, and I want to be like a knight or a Viking or whatever, right? And that's not historical awareness, that's not historical education, that's not even political literacy, because if you approach history like that, it means that you basically have no idea even of what history serves for, in a broader sense, at the service of your own country. If you love it, there is nothing really wrong with loving your own country, but we all realize where certain intentions come from at some point, and that's I can't tell. I even passed through that, and I therefore I can tell you freely, and I haven't lost interest in the topics I liked before. It's just I see them now in a completely different perspective, because I have a perspective. What we do lack is a perspective in many ways. So today I would like to talk to you about the communal Middle Ages, a bit between myth and reality, or better, just focusing on certain aspects that can be useful for an interpretation of communal civilization that, as we have been saying up to now, is basically suffering from this astonishing forgetfulness from the side of the masses. And most of this history gravitates on naturally the richest, the most urbanized lands. Individually, if you essentially central and northern Italy, southern France, the Flanders, right, the Rhine Valley, other areas also, partly, but some talking especially about urban centers. Surely in Spain there is communal history after all. There are other areas that see a important, the broader Western European area is actually pretty communal in nature, right? And communes, even here, we will not be defining them as specifically, right? Or we'll try to at least to observe certain aspects of that, to maybe to approach them better, but we will have to talk about them again more specifically, especially for their origin. But we can identify mainly this center. Actually, it's mostly central northern Italy and the Flanders, right? These are in degree of, in scale importance, the single most ones. Then you have the Hanseatic League, you have other centers, but there are somewhat different experiences that are to be framed also in peculiar contexts, etc., and that we surely include in the communal phenomenon, but still in a different fashion. Proportion here is a key note. So there is. Let's start from commonplaces. Like, first of all, in some times in the past, we have presumably, even in that popular culture that we always criticize, and it's a kind of our scapegoat. But we have to be honest, first of all, about our own misunderstandings, rather than criticizing some unknown author out there. Is that we cannot divide essentially the communal age from, let's say, the feudal phase, right? Communes and the feudal system are not opposed, right? The peace, for example, that Frederick I Barbarossa, Frederick I of Hohenstaufen reached with the Italian Communes is pretty meaningful about this, right? Because this is actually one of the single most important victories of properly communes over the feudal hierarchy, right? But we will see now that there wasn't a conceptual opposition to the thing, right? And this very peace brought to the strengthening, actually, of the feudal bonds on paper, right? The emperor, as king of Italy, granted to the communes of the Lombard League to continue to collect the royalties, right, the regalia in Latin, that it were basically the taxes of public competence, fundamentally public property, in exchange of the oath with which the same communes recognized themselves as collective vassals of the monarch, right? The defeat, right, brought from Legnano to the peace of Constance, right, was essentially the sanctionment of certain rights were recognized within the boundaries of the Holy Roman Imperial constitution, we could say, in an anachronistic sense, but talking about properly the relations, at least, that existed between the public authority and the local communities, right? And Italy is definitely the brightest example of communal civilization, and we can observe in it families that have given birth to the commune, coming both from the aristocratic or the bourgeois background, right? There is no distinction between a feudal class that lived out the city and an urban class of merchants, right? In explaining how the commune emerged, right? In both cases, doesn't matter where the commune emerges from, that there is a great diversity in this sense. We will have to talk a lot about that at some point. But gave birth to these political nuclei, had a terrific propulsive force, right? And that exemplifies how the same elites, essentially, that ruled elsewhere in any other context, political, institutional one in Europe, were essentially of the same nature, right? Throughout all of Europe, we can talk about communes, right? Albeit only for Italy and in part southern France, we can talk about city-state proper. This is also another term that comes to be very important, that we use also, like the cives, the citizens of these communes, didn't essentially get satisfied of the autonomy within their own walls, right? As these cities had been built autonomously, right? And this is true, for example, instead for the German imperial cities or the great bourgeois communes of the Flanders, right? That remained fundamentally within their own boundaries. They began to subdue, in a more or less complete way, the surrounding district, right? That of which the commune became the collective lord. This is a very important discriminant, right? Because communes naturally have something in common all over Europe, but they also differ a lot, and definitely the creation of a territorial seigneury from the side of the commune, of the urban commune, is something you find mostly, in fact, in the Italian countryside and in other areas of southern France. There's all lines of ancient urbanization, also of greater Roman legacy, also in the infrastructures, in the communications, etc. And they restart from these bases, right? And consider that in a world that naturally, as in all pre-industrial society, was largely rural, right? The rules of coexistence were prevalently the ones of the same countryside. Here we look even geographically speaking at the picture, like the majority of the communes were concentrated just in the northern coasts of Europe, and especially on the ones of the Mediterranean, right? We start seeing, for example, great centers were connected with North Sea, like Cologne, also the Channel, naturally, with Paris and London, after all, on the Seine and on the Thames, naturally entered in this broader circuit of traffic. Think about the Hanseatic League, so northern Germany, and having especially this cross, like between east and west, from the Baltic to the North Sea as a trade routes, but especially the Mediterranean. And we have made a lot of videos actually on the Italian communes, on the Italian trade, the importance of the city as the main trade center in this region of Europe, and as the greatest treasurers, fundamentally, the greater exchangers, the greatest, the most developed communities, as a matter of fact, because of the continuous acquisitions of wealth, of knowledge, of capacities to, in fact, to extend. There is a quantitative reason, like if you wonder why, I don't know, it's not that the German imperial cities or the communes of Flanders weren't, let's say, as anxious of extending their power as the Italian ones, for example, but simply they had less resources and were framed in certain contexts where, for example, outside of the city walls, they found a much stronger feudal elite that in a way curbed their expansion, and the fact that they existed in the first place actually is that they fundamentally emerged from a bit more decentralized areas from the one of the greatest seigneurial powers, whereas in those other worlds you find not much of communes in practice, even if of course the local communities de facto were communes in many ways, right? When you talk about communes here, we don't have to equate, if we want really to be proper, the thing to the city center, right? There were communes, even if, for example, if you look at the Italian countryside, where the city is really the landlord there. Now we'll see in a while, but there were still these rural communes, for example, that were associations of peasantry, right? That they had their own organization, they had their own institutions and administration, and they actually were pretty much scared by the expansion of the city. Right? This is no different in other contexts at the end of the day, and there is a dichotomy for which that surpasses the rural systems of interaction that is observable in the city communes, right? And that is that they were located fundamentally in a qualified, surely qualified by the same institutions. Net was in fact the feudal one, and it was towards the above, right? As with the communes as collective vassals of the king, right, and of the emperor at the end of the day, if at least its power was reached there. That's why we're talking of lands of the Holy Roman Empire, of France, of Spain, of England, of other areas that, of course, this relation could vary, right? But and also seigneurial one, however, towards the bottom, as with the communes as collective lords of their district. This is important because you understand that at this point the commune is just like one ladder of the hierarchy, and its position only depends fundamentally on its power, and that's why you find in different areas of Europe this height change, right? In certain areas of Europe the communes are at the bottom of society. In others they are sometimes at a local level. Maybe they're the highest authority, as a matter of fact, de facto. Then there is the formal recognition of higher powers that don't think, however, they were so high that in that sense compared to the city-state in itself. And we're talking about sheer, look at how many troops communes could field. Look at certain armies that could be levied by the Flemish, by the Italians, even by, look at Cologne. But, this could be done, look even at Abbey of Fulda, right? It's said to have had 20,000 armed men, right? So here we are talking naturally about the Middle Ages. There is no clear stability. There is no clear hierarchy in factual terms, right? Everything changes and evolves, and we don't have to make a history of the Middle Ages to explain this, aside from all the other videos we make. But there is this level of actual power that is able to levy enormous amount of. We've always bring forward the example of Florence, that basically had a greater income than the whole Kingdom of England, right? That gives you a proportion. At the beginning of the 14th century, what we are concretely talking about. And as a matter of fact, the prestige of the urban seats had always been recognized, right, since the beginning of the Middle Ages. This was determined by the tradition of centrality inherited from the ancient world, right? The economical vivacity of the mercantile and financiary urban classes, the charisma of the bishop, of the episcopal authority, that naturally in the Roman Church were under, in the city, right? Not just in the Roman one, at this point also in the East, but that aside from the Irish model that had somewhat expanded at the very beginning of the Middle Ages in the British Isles, eventually the Roman one was re-exported in this sense. And this is the reason why we find, for example, in the city, the Longobards dukes, the Frankish counts, right? It's from here that the local authorities, since early medieval times, ruled from, right? The city in Europe never goes to sleep, especially the southern Yugo. But even in the north, of course, many cities had declined, had even disappeared, but fundamentally, especially thanks to the episcopal organization, in, I would say, northern Europe, the centrality of the city was revived, was kept alive. There weren't many other options, as long as you were fundamentally a Christian power that wanted to rise at the level of kingship, right, and even more. And in the cities also started to rule from, and starting properly to centralize their power, princely dynasties, right? And this happened more often than it was recognized. This happened since the post-Carolingian era, in many ways. That the princes, the lords in general, began to see in the city naturally an important area of, if anything, of dialogue, that they had to take in consideration if they wanted to expand, to be successful. In the cities, there was the early rise of the important religious schools, the canon ones of the great cathedrals, fundamentally, and eventually the universities, right? The city becomes, by definition, the center from which this higher and highly skilled personnel was necessary to the administration of greater political systems to be necessary. The cities welcomed the very vivacious royal and princely courts, right? For example, look at Capetian Paris, that creates fundamentally a national identity on the city and the surroundings since an early date, because it's actually since Merovingian times that Paris was important. But in the lower Middle Ages, especially probably in the communal phase, that this thing increases as towards the role of a proper capital of the Kingdom of France, right? And if you look even at the Palermo of Frederick II of Hohenstaufen, and you can see there the realization of the most unprejudicial crossing between different cultures, basically becoming the cultural capital of its times. And it's more the late medieval urban civilization that produces this evenly, right? That goes towards the modern era, the centralized state, and naturally the city in there assumes a paradigmatic role for the control, even of surrounding countryside. There is the increased subordination of the peasant communities in the late Middle Ages. So the city becomes the point of reference of every sovereign, right? And that's why during the modern age, properly capitals are stabilized because of bureaucracy and administration and so on. But we cannot see even in here, especially for medieval times, the dichotomy city-countryside as a sort of dialectic between backwardness and progress, right? First of all, as we've explained many times, without the countryside, the city cannot exist. Literally, there is no city without countryside in pre-industrial society. It's impossible. You need these people to be fed with something, right? And if the city emerges, it's because the countryside has already emerged, right? It's because it's the countryside that is rich, that is fertile, that is productive, that is inserted in broader trade circuits, right? And this is particularly evident for the same areas of the greater development of communal civilization. Italy, Flanders, the hubs of the great intercontinental trade between Europe and as far as China at some point during the 13th century. The great estates, the weapons, the power over the countryside have dictated the rules throughout almost all the Middle Ages, and essentially suggesting the form of social hierarchies and fixing the ways of politics, but always using the city as properly point of reference, because the city was the market, was the place of the urbanization of the aristocratic families. Right? It was the seat which you became vassal of the bishop. But you can't look at medieval civilization and say, this place, we don't know there were cities, like, there were maybe just forts, hill forts, something like that. That's not a wealthy society. It's not an advanced society. Right? Basically, until you don't find a city, you can't properly say this is something that really has much of an articulated structure from a social point, from a political point of view. And the urban coexistence also filtered and reprojected towards the outwards the experiences that were re-elaborated within the coexistence within the walls of different classes and different political and social models, right? Even if they came originally from the countryside, right? So there is an innovation that the city produces, propels, right? Assumes as a catalyst function. But that innovation also re-elaborated material that was always, decisively for the medieval millennium in Europe, the encounter between the Latin and the Germanic worlds. Right. This is the moment in which properly the dynamism of medieval civilization as we know it was in a sense seeded, because without the the encounter between the Roman tradition of cities, of education, of literally of saddle legacy, and the Germanic confederative, autonomistic, and kind of independent political institutional vision, what we know as the commune probably would have not existed. Right, the ancient city, in spite of its autonomy, was something substantially different in a way, and the communes expand, especially in Western Europe. In that phase, you don't have quite the same thing. For example, in the Byzantine world, even if there are cities that we know were curbed fundamentally by central power, but it's exactly the point, right? Outside of Constantinople is a city that fundamentally at some point controls the whole empire. Just Thessalonica maybe resembles a little bit the Western cities, but it's in a different context, right? It will not have the same capacities, the same possibilities, right? You can't say the potential, because the same West at that point was creating its own models because of certain conditions, right? But there is properly a recipe, a combination of factors that allows the rise of the commune and of the city-state as we know it from communal civilization. If we look at post-Carolingian Italy, differently from the rest of Europe, and with the exception of certain areas like the Friuli or Piedmont, didn't produce territorial principalities. This is very important. Italy was the only post-Carolingian kingdom that basically kept operating substantially from the city and its district, as in the political and administrative forms, and at least by a in terms of sheer power, right? The seigneurial territory it does develop, but doesn't manage to detach itself from the city as a merely, kind of a chiefly rural power, like you find in northern France or in Germany, for example. And one of the causes of the Italian exception is to be found in the fact that the territorial principality has been substituted by the commune, right? That in Italy, differently from the regions north of the Alps, doesn't get satisfied of the autonomy within its own walls, but begins to extend an hegemonic control of its district, right? And what properly builds up what can be defined as a city-state, right? Because this is something that goes beyond the mere local community. It's basically encompassing in an expansionistic fashion other communities under its control in developing a centralized system of government over these communities. You find it in another astonishingly few amount of circumstances and elsewhere, and not in by the same degree, right, in the rest of Europe. And as we were saying before, we cannot attach like a bourgeois mercantile origin to the Italian communes, right? Because it would contrast with the very frequent cases in which the promoting class of the communal organism had been aristocracy, the military aristocracy, right? It's frequent that the initiative is taken fundamentally by the vassalitic clientele of the powerful bishops, right? A clientele that is almost always at least, recruited among the major knights properly of the district, of the city district. If you're interested in this topic, I don't think we ever made a video on the origins of the Italian communes, but we have talked a lot about Ottonian Italy and the Ottonian policy of the bishop counts in the Italian peninsula. That was, basically the only way a true control on it could be maintained at some point. And therefore the role of bishops in here, also from a cultural point of view, right, rather than just political or even military, right, it's dramatically important. Here there are the roots of the same Gregorian reforms and the struggle for investiture. So we will keep talking about it, of course, but if you're interested in the topic, you can go mostly in the Holy Roman Imperial playlist, or otherwise the Ottonian Germany playlist, or simply the Italian Communes playlist, or Medieval Italy. It's better because that's still in a pre-communal phase, and we must not, however, even think that the Italian Commune is just born through exclusively, at least, through a military aristocracy, right? It's important instead to highlight the elements of continuity between the experience of the communes and the previous social hierarchies, just not of seigneurial background, therefore. And we have especially to take into consideration that the origins of the different communes are, in fact, very different, right? Especially for the times and the ways in which this happened, but also for the types of social groups that were authors of it. And the eventual political developments of the single communes were naturally conditioned by their different origins in many ways. But at the same time, it's also important to highlight that different communes actually produced similar institutions, right? There is a striking homology, and you've been studying this thing for a while. And you realize that albeit there was a very few in common after all that apparently these institutions should have, especially given the apparent, at least, originality of this system. At least surely the communal, we know when the commune was born. Like for certain communes we don't know specifically, but we have a pretty detailed timeline. By that time we were pretty well documented after all. considering the rest of European standards. But the point is that the institutions of these communes are developed almost in parallel, right? The governmental systems, the bureaucracy, the administration, and there are reasons. Now today maybe we'll not explain. We'll explain it in another video on the Italian Communes, but I think I explained it somewhere already. One of those videos I made, and they are a good example, definitely, of how an institutional, a uniform institutional experience can have this degree of different background, right? And naturally, there is a lot of imitation, there is a lot of sharing, right? Most of the reason why this happened is that this systems was pretty much interconnected, right? Never think of the Middle Ages, not even for an instant, as you have been told, I don't know, where, a place where information didn't travel fast, people didn't know about, people believed that across, I don't know, 10 kilometers, yeah, maybe the peasantry, but definitely were ruled in the place, knew very well, not just what happened across, some mile, but what was happening on a much larger scale, especially during low Middle Ages. Then the interconnection of Europe is astonishing, and it's always higher. It's ever higher. And there is definitely a compaction along these lines. What could be homogeneous, heterogeneous at the beginning, would be assimilated politically, right, over time. Because even if there was an advantage, but there were properly even some important bases, right? Especially if you look at the Italian Commune, you see that it's always of a same degree of at least it becomes to span at some point a certain degree of size of its city, populace, or its district size. There is a range of centers, at least that make it, because previously some wouldn't or couldn't, right? So that's where the heterogeneity actually comes from. But at a certain point, there is an equilibrium that is reached that lasts for some time, especially between the 12th to 13th century, as properly territorial districts, because these were basically the same Roman districts, right? That also they corresponded to the diocese, like the rest of post-Roman Europe, actually. That's and eventually the Christian part, albeit different, you can imagine the diversity even in different regions of Europe in this regard, but it's still, at least at a certain distance, if you look at a regional scale, there were naturally some similarities. And in order to explain this phenomenon, we naturally also have to abandon the continuously mistaken recourse to kind of well-defined scansions, right? That postulate, for example, a social exchange when there is not, right? The idea of the passage from a feudal to a communal age is not to be seen here, right? It's basically the same communities. Even if you look at in the late Roman Empire, the very early Middle Ages, if you look at cities like Milan from its epigraphy, and you see that basically the attitude, the mental idea, this municipal ideology is there, present, right? It's in an embryonal stage, but the idea that were powerful aristocracies within the city, and that the city had an importance in a net of higher powers, and it was a trade center, an important market. And it had its own district, its own episcopal, but it's there fundamentally. So things do not really change enormously after all, right? In these realities, and at the same time, when there is a change, we can't see we rarely see a dramatic one, right? Unless there is something particularly traumatic, but that's not much of the case, and probably it's the surrounding system. It also helps maintaining this stability. Think about when Frederick I razed Milan to the ground. What did Milanese do is they literally rebuilt the city from scratch. Right? I don't know of any other example in Europe that's considered that Milan was the largest city in Europe at the time. So it's not even to say, okay, well, they burned down a town, like, okay, a village, rebuilt it. These guys rebuilt properly civitas, right? In the proper Latin sense of the medieval reality that creates the idea of citizenry, of citizenship, and of the city-state identity. And you understand there that there were the resources, but also the existence of a model that was not to be put in discussion at any level, because things worked that way. There weren't many other ways to recreate fundamentally that reality, to modify it. And we can naturally see maybe a different timing naturally in the happening of certain events, but never quite a break with even the change of the regimes within the city-state is is triggered by fundamentally but the same communities that had always been there, that naturally one maybe goes up, one other goes down, but it's still part of the same system after all. That does change, but doesn't see like the literal overthrown of an element, of a class, of a and everybody revolves around the city after all. And the complexity of judgment on the Italian communes is confirmed by the events relative to the clash of the communes against Frederick I Barbarossa. And we made a video about this. I don't remember the title, but it's something like, well, I don't remember, but if you go in medieval playlist, it's like for a perspective on the Italian communes and the Holy Roman Empire. It deals with that. We will come back. We haven't talked much about it, honestly, but we'll have to come back on this. We made a video on Frederick II of all and stuff, and we made something else about mostly from a military point of view of the Italian communal armies and so on. But we have assessed already how this clash between the communes and the Holy Roman Emperor in Lombardy hadn't fundamentally much of national and also much of social either. Right, many communes of the Lombard League had aristocratic rather than bourgeois ruling classes. Right, this is not the clash between the Germans or the Italians. This isn't the clash between the feudality against the merchants. It's nothing like that. Right, and also those communes that had a bourgeois ruling class, for example, were very far from having an idea of of a common Italian or even Lombard identity. Like if you look at the Lombard League in this sense, I mean, actually there is much of proto-national in many of these aspects, but Lombardy was considered like a nation. Like if you look at how other countries called the Italians, for example, they were the Lombards. And the interesting thing about these identities is that the Italians themselves, when they went abroad, for example, as merchants, like as literates and so on, they recognized themselves as Lombards, right? But when they came back home, like they were all, I am from this city here, and outside of it there is another city, and we're not alike, right? And they surely had a lot in common, actually, as the whole Italian communal civilization proves, because this was, highly homogeneous. The more it went on, especially, and but the struggle between the communes and the Lombard League wasn't about this idea of an external foreign threat, right? That didn't help, right? Because when you have even just to negotiate, and one speaks German and the other speaks Italian, the thing starts getting complicated. We know it because the same documents actually show that, because they all had their own respective records. One, stated something, the other stated another, because the different translators and with political purposes, tried to modify the statements, this placita, for example. And in here, however, the same Barbarossa had been called to Lombardy by the Italians. This is the point. of the same communes were worried about Milanese expansion and said, look, if there is someone here who can bring order, it's theoretically the higher authority. Italy was a kingdom, but it didn't have a king. And the Holy Roman Emperor was the higher authority, and it had, it was now generations that the emperor didn't descend south of the Alps, but that was the main point of reference, and it was a normal duty for a Holy Roman Emperor to get to Italy. Guess why? Because if you didn't get to Italy and seize Italic crown, you couldn't be crowned emperor quite easily, right? So that was an enormous deal, and that also tells you why by the 12th century, this thing gets revived, and fundamentally up to the 14th, there will be these attempts to subdue the Italian peninsula by the Germanic emperors, which does not succeed, and it largely does not succeed because of the resistance of the Italian communes of the center and of the north, right? And this is happening for reasons that we will explain in a dedicated video, but they had to do mostly about the about money, as always, about the royalties, as we have seen before, right? This, the arrival of Barbarossa in Italy has nothing to do with nationalistic interpretations. He was the king of the Romans. He descended in Italy, doing his own job, right? As king of Italy, by the way, at least, or would be king of Italy. That would have to be recognized as such, but it was normally done because there was always someone who would need to see it recognized, because this peripheral powers, needed even the recognition, the confirmation, the legitimization of the prerogatives that they had acquired, and that's where the struggle was fought, right? He was not like a German oppressor in an away game, but simply less absenteeist king compared to his own predecessor. To put it very simply, because naturally, I presume actually most of the times I talk to people that know perfectly what I'm talking about in just the main coordinates of medieval history, but this is just even for making maybe someone else that has not practiced with the time and space of these events to realize what this could be seen like. And very meaningful about all of this is the way out of this struggle when, as we have said before, Barbarossa accepted that the communes kept to collect the tax incomes that were of royal competences, right? The regalia, as they were called, with the condition, at least, that in exchange the communes declared themselves to be his own vassals, right? And the thing is, telling the truth, a bit more bitter than this, as you understand. I mean, these peoples had, been fighting for a generation because of this struggle. I mean, it was a struggle that engulfed half of Europe in this regard, because everything was connected to this reality. I mean, even the outre-mer policy or the relations with the other major kingdoms, all passed through this balance, right? There is no history of the 12th century if you think you can cross out what the Untitled thought, but also what the Lombard League thought of the situation, and it's possibly the single most important event after all in Europe, because hadn't that happened, probably we would have seen very interesting developments in where in another in the idea of imperial power, of universal monarchy in Western Europe. So it's obvious that this pact was actually a peace treaty that so the Hohenstaufen defeated by the Lombard League, so that we are your vassals, but we don't pay to you except what is not even symbolic, but this minor part of what the regalia are, and for the rest we keep doing whatever we want. Like the other thing before the war, the other option that the Hohenstaufen wanted was basically to take away literally everything that these communes earned. And you understand at this point how and why those wars were fought, because otherwise, these communes wouldn't care that much. Would actually even be glad about a bit of a border being brought from their side. There would have been still conflicts and contrasts, etc. But that was probably the mistake of the Hohenstaufen, that had all the interest of definitely of drying Italy of all its riches, but this was done in a way that the same communes that had actually called him there and that were trying to save themselves from the Milanese expansionism, even passed basically to the Milanese side, because they said, we called this guy for putting order, and all he wants is basically taking us away everything. Right? And this is in a nutshell the history of how it happened, and it was definitely worth doing that, because a subjugated Lombardy at that point, it was hands down, East and West would have been reunited, would have recreated easily the Roman Empire. There's no doubt. The Hohenstaufen would have conquered Constantinople. We know that they arrived actually a step from doing that with Henry VI. But you have to understand, in fact, the interest that stands behind that. Right? The fact that the Hohenstaufen lost, in a way, it's the reason why we had a Renaissance, for example. These may be reductive statements because naturally the picture is more complicated, but this is also not to make anyone indulge in saying the one side was right, the other was wrong, right? Because they all had actually pretty good motivations for doing what they do, as all people that fight a war fundamentally have in insight, or at least reasons that are good in the measure of of conveniency for them, of course, not because of a moral judgment of what it actually is. But it's always the same old story, right? In a world that fundamentally does that all the time, because all of Europe in a way is at war. In the same way, it's just that here there is much more at stake, because it's literally from seizing the richest land out there. And that's why we talk about a communal civilization, and we rarely actually address the feudal civilization. It was properly in many ways also the one that allowed the civilization to emerge at some point, but they were at least two different forms of the emanation of the same system after all. And we have seen how the opposition commune feudality doesn't quite stand on its feet. But it's obvious, also another aspect of, in fact, of this very thing, that is the refeudalization of this world through the same peace of Constance. Because guess what? Here the same feudal hierarchies were being maintained. Right, as we were saying before, nobody within these communes was even dreaming of saying, like, the imperial power didn't exist, that, these communes had to be free in absolute terms. Like, the most radical ideas in those terms were invented, like, in the Florentine, Renaissance, where they said that some jurist that had some political ideology about said, okay, yeah, in theory the commune could stand on its feet even against other authorities. Nobody had authority, but in practice this never happened. Like, all the people believed that it was a positive thing to have an emperor, right? It wasn't a positive thing when he came knocking at the door to take away all of these people had fundamentally treasured over time, because that was of public competence by name, to do things that were exactly, by the way, the same things that the emperor would like to have done with the same communes. So yeah, the communes were expanding on weaker communes, but still the emperor would have wanted to expand on the communes. So it was literally, it's useless to entrench ourselves behind the ideological fiction, right? This, as we were saying before, were pretty valid motivations to think one thing of the other. But the point is that, of course, these communes remain under the Holy Roman Empire. And that is exactly, after, in the following century, these powers will start to develop the more seigneurial character, as we'll see now, that will be delegated in part by the same imperial authority. The various Italian lordships were in many ways framed under the hierarchy of the Holy Roman Empire, right? They were doing the whole thing totally by themselves, or at least, mostly requiring the imperial help, or, exploiting it in a way when it came. But, after the Hohenstaufen, and the strength of these imperial interventions was all ever weaker, and still essentially buying those feudal titles from now an empire that, after the collapse of the Hohenstaufen in the second half of the 13th century, didn't even properly have a century. We're talking with princely powers, not with an imperial authority at that point. We're often, in fact, way richer than them. That's the reason why they bought that title, because they had the power, the money to do that. And if you study the history of Henry VII or of John of Bohemia, and even Ludwig of Wittelsbach, actually, even before, you see what we're talking about. At some point, these communes were paying the same German expeditions to just calling the emperors there, or at least the kings of the Romans, to do something in Italy for their interest. The acceleration of the feudal logics and the consolidations of the same, exactly by those communes that the historians of the beginning of the 20th century were still considering as the anti-feudal novelty of the Italian Middle Ages. It's completely opposite. Completely opposite. There was nothing anti-feudal about it. Nothing. Right? These weren't the rebels, the independentists, the secessionists, the separatists. These people were actually fine within the empire. And they had all the interest, actually, of remaining under it. But it's deeper than that. Like, it's a part of even of the deeper connections between these areas of Europe, Central Europe, Southern Europe, that had, especially in the capital Germany and Italy, had represented now a major civilization production in many ways. If you look at the end of the Middle Ages, Italy and Germany, for example, are the most technologically advanced countries in Europe. They have certain characteristics that will expand dramatically their cultural impact in the continent. I mean, there is a deep connection between these two areas of Europe since the 10th century that must be, and even before, telling the truth, way before, that brought too much of what even, certain proper federal traditions that disappeared in many ways with the rise of the nation state, right? And that, in fact, as a consequence, got this stuff wrong, historiographically speaking. And that's why certain people still believe in that. They're buying just in nationalistic historiography from the 19th century. And this agreement, dependently on how it had been reached, whether diplomatically or on the battlefield, contained within itself the need of a state of Roman tradition, in a word and another, right? And after all, here the Romanity is truly at the center of the issue, right? Since the 12th century, the revival of studying of Roman law is, we're making an entire playlist dedicated to that. It's at the center of the whole struggle for investitures. The rise of universities naturally produce it eventually. In fact, the struggle between papacy and empire, broadly meant, aside from the investitures, but also, the struggle over the peninsula in later times. And in the Holy Roman Empire, and with ambitions that are truly of universal breadth. And the aim naturally was to centralize in a world that didn't know much of that since a long time, and that was emerging exactly in these city-states. They were providing a model, where they were providing probably even an ideological fuel for the paradoxically for the same Holy Roman Imperial centralization process. Frederick Barbarossa uses all the Bolognese jurists that probably he didn't think much of. Like in the mindset of Barbarossa, the Italian Communes were probably like a monster, because nobody in countries like Germany or could even dream of the idea that a commoner ruling a commune could receive the active submission of a nobleman of the countryside. This was like completely insane, and that's part of this cultural gap. It's also what probably didn't play much in favor of the Swabians on the long run, because there is a genuine cultural misassessment. I mean, military speaking, they were doing the thing right, but politically speaking, that's where they lost, and that's how it's mostly the cause of the thing, right? They deeply underestimated what these communes were really creating. They underestimated their resources from a moral and material point of view, and they lacked the general understanding of the mechanisms that played within them, right? And the thing went improved sensibly over time, but over time you have the collapse even of the German monarchy in the mid 13th century. So that is, as we were saying before, what causes an enormous deal in European history overall. The concept here was still, however, maintaining the vitality of the vassalic beneficiary relation of Germanic tradition. This was true as well, right? It's not that, I don't know, nor the Italians or even less the Germans were now copying the Roman state. We have been talking extensively about this in the videos about medieval law, that the revival of Roman law at the beginning wasn't seen at all, and it was properly actually never seen even afterwards, even if when the importance properly of the Roman legacy was stressed. The Roman authority, let's say, was stressed not to copy it, but just to fill the gaps of the local law, fundamentally. That was framed under vassalic beneficiary net, at least, right? Which was more complicated, because as we have seen, the communes fundamentally escape it, or at least they're actually framed under it, but still in a way that they can't afford to even defeat the emperor in open field, which is a thing that definitely has its own weight. So the king, the monarch in general, whether here I say often emperor, but as we were saying before, that he could have been just king of the Romans, king of Italy, the authorities, which is until he's not crowned Holy Roman Emperor, he's not technically emperor, but it's a subtlety. The sovereign was oriented to superintend fundamentally in both in an active and essentially constitutive fashion the ever more complex political mosaic of its territories, right? Managing to include also a new collective organism that was the urban organized community. And consider that, technically, if you look at Barbarossa in Germany, was dealing with an increasing, under him actually, they went the closest to create some national monarchy like France or England, but from that time on, there is just fragmentation and privatization of political power in Germany. And that naturally has to deal with this essentially federal tradition that is revived, reinforced in this sense. So, that Germany was up to the 19th century the single most politically fragmented country in Europe. Like, there was no place like that, right? There still, however, there was a an imperial frame of vassalitic beneficiary nets that, albeit, misfunctioning at many levels, was still preventing, in a way, from, for example, from these lands to be taken over by an external power, right? The case with Italy is different. With Italy, basically, from the beginning of the modern age, there are foreign powers that come and control these lands, even if in a decentralized fashion, in which the local aristocracies have always, a substantial power on their own, but they're subdued properly to a foreign domination. Germany will be ravaged and destroyed and suffered enormous structural damage. Think about the 30 Years' War, but fundamentally would keep going on in that fashion, and it was even unoccupable in some way, because it was such a mess of jurisdictions but it was a problem. Like, until the Zollverein, not even the German economy could take off because of all that still old protectionistic and anachronistic system that was in place. But from the Middle Ages, in fact. But the same more mature commune that is eventually, over time, is more powerful, more organized, will conquer the district, as we have seen, behaving as collective lord. Right? As we have seen, the German presence in Italy eclipses itself fundamentally, as at least in an hegemonic sense. Not that it had reached it at that. And these city-states start becoming even something more. Right? The thing had begun since the beginning, as we've seen. Actually, the arrival of Barbarossa was triggered by the same Milanese expansion that was already pretty advanced. We made a video, which was a very early one, about the Milanese expansion in its district. We will come back on that topic. And this expansion was fundamentally based on new, say maybe not new, but specific instruments of subjugation of the countryside. And in the greater part of cases, the communes substituted, therefore, the secular powers of the bishops in the surrounding area of the city. We're talking about secular powers of the bishops because this is properly what they had, right? They had the communal power. Since Ottonian times, the bishop was invested both of the ecclesiastical and the secular power, right? As counts, properly, or better, as, title holders of communal authority in the district. And actually they were overlapping, because this is something that dated back to Carolingian Europe. Like, every district corresponded fundamentally to the diocese, and it was the count as a secular ruler and the bishop as a spiritual ruler. Right now the bishop had actually put together the same thing in this specific region of Europe. It's present also in other areas, but especially in Italy since the 10th century. And therefore it means that the commune can expand, even in the name sometimes of the bishop, even if it was actually sometimes knocking him out, right, and taking over his power. But it was done still on the wake of the pre-existing juridical prerogatives of whoever ruled in this area. So when the communal conquests were extended beyond the previous episcopal domination, so we're talking literally about the boundaries of the city, very rarely the rural populations welcomed the commune as a freeing force compared to the allegedly oppressive banal lordship of the rural lords, right? The peasants instead, but they often feared the fiscal efficiency of the new communal seigneury, right? It was actually acting like a seigneury, right? It was no different from another landlord. And between the end of the 11th and the first half of the 12th century, the communal ruling class developed a conscience of there being actually a public and legitimate power par excellence, right? So they were developing this very high self-confidence, right? You don't. That's also we made videos on the communal armies. We've seen how, why is that in the 12th century and 13th century did this Lombardy and Tuscany had actually the most advanced infantry in Europe. It could even withstand the charges of the imperial cavalry that in the 13th century was at the peak of its military effectiveness, because these people believed the freaking much in themselves. They had that was their land. What is astonishing of this mindset is that these people didn't even give a damn about the wolves feudal, the wolf. I mean, that they like when they had naturally to deal with the feudal authorities, with the emperor, that they behaved in an appropriate fashion at the diplomatic seat, etc. But for the rest, these communes were only about themselves. All they cared about was making money on their own, and they couldn't care less about the rest, even if they were all connected to the rest. I mean, that was the only aim. This is also a paradox, right? This literally were the hubs of the intercontinental trade, as we've seen, and they were perfectly aware of whatever was happening all around them, and they didn't care to, let's say, substitute themselves to other constituted authority. They outside of their practical needs, right? They simply said, okay, now I can expand in my district. I will develop an ideology that backs it, a juridical prerogative that will support it. But then it ends there. For the rest, they do whatever the hell they care, and there was nothing teleological in it, right? It was simply about their independence in many ways, and this contributed to culture. For example, many of the first consuls that we've seen were essentially the first governors of the communes. They were this kind of collegial magistracy, like the ancient Roman one, fundamentally. It was made up of judges and notaries, right? It was the same families from which even the knights came from, but they were diversified at this point. We're talking about families, we're talking about extended clans here. And they accelerated the valorization of the commune as a res publica, properly as a republic, and in many cases even, expanding the thing from an ideological point of view, claiming the communal right to govern the district as legitimate collective governors in the stead of the older count of Carolingian memory, right? To which also properly an imperial hierarchy was attached, right, in there. So it was still within the boundaries of legitimacy for feudal standards, but taking prerogatives that were completely invented in many ways. Just, why do I have this prerogative? Well, simply because I can't control this land and these communities. That's their thinking. And the jurists define this as the law of districtuation, in a way. The same word contado, for example, in Italian, that comes from comitatus. In fact, it was the land of the commes, of the count. Is in fact the province that is conditioned by the commune and derives properly from that public conception of communal power of the countryside, right? And the domestic political dialectic of the commune was actually very harsh, right? Within the city walls, there was a lot of conflict, especially starting from the end of the 12th, beginning of the 13th century, where the social classes now began to struggle against each other, because the original ruling class of the consular class, so-called, at the beginning it was fairly inclusive, like, the more people the better, right? As long as we expand. Now we have to consolidate. Many people, especially with the great economical demographic growth of the countryside, are especially the demographic one of the countryside and the economical one of the city, are immigrating into the city. So there are a lot of people cannot be included anymore. So that's where something starts to happen. The so-called popul emerges and starts struggling against the nobility in many ways. But even in there, it's not properly a class war. It's something more complex, because the same people have their own elite, right? But we have talked about this in other videos. And there was definitely, different social classes were struggling, but also familiar groups, right, that fought bitterly at the aim of affirming their power. But there is an interesting aspect of this, is that these conflicts didn't undermine some basic principles. For example, the public character of the commune, and consequently its right to propose itself as the hegemonic force on the countryside. It was nobody's interest to say, okay, now, let's make this whole thing fail, right? If we sink, the whole thing is gonna sink with us. No. This proves also that there was enough room actually for political action in many ways. And in fact, the consequence of the conflicts were rather the changes in the internal systems of government. While the main city families kept to be represented in the councils, there were more or less large collegial organs, also more or less assembler ones in nature. Between the 12th and 13th century was perceived the need to substitute, sporadically first and systematically eventually, to the collegial power of the consuls that could be, as we've seen, were usually 2, they could be even 3 or up to 10 at some point, because the thing had expanded naturally, so even new magistrates had been added. But to put next to them also a executive power concentrated in the hands of a single person. This was firstly the so-called podesta, right? That in the first phase of experimentation was to be since the beginning actually wasn't like that, but was a citizen of even of the same commune sometimes, but more regularly was a foreigner intended as someone came from another city, right? That had to simply supervise the college of the councils, but eventually, becoming in fact fully this fully external presence that came to govern in the city, naturally within the respect of the local statutes, but cited only by certain councils. And the idea was that this formula wouldn't create, here we have discussed a lot the podesta regimes, and we can't digress further because otherwise the video will be too long. But that these people had to be technically separated from the local interests, right? And this figure soon became a military figure as well, right? It spread basically everywhere in the first decades of the 13th century, and the point is that the local communities didn't record to him much because of his neutrality, but because he was seen as a professional politician, right? Someone who could, first of all, that was an expert of law and in the art of government. That is a term that starts appearing properly as such, right? It is an art, right? It's not science, it's an art. It's something you have to practice in order to have. Sometimes they pass this experience down within the same families that always went to govern the particular city. There were lots of interests in common. These people naturally weren't commoners. They were people of some some importance in a broader sense. They were increasingly assuming a military character, because at the end of the day, war was spreading once again. These people had to govern the city and to rule it with these intricate balances of the city, and knowing how to even to convince, to persuade, right, to mediate, but also to properly act when it was needed. So there is a change in the figure of the podestat that eventually transforms itself in a kind of lord, right? Or at least, it's the lords that start as podestats sometimes, and they eventually rise to a higher power. And with the adoption of the podestat, also the faction clashes that ravaged the cities at some point had to be put down, right? The presence of the podestat had put an end to the wild, disorderly seizing of the places of power, to put an end to the excessive flexibility of the governmental organs towards the private and contingent interests, right? So it was not really just a pure reaction of the order against disorder, but it was just the kind of unavoidable response towards the objective problems, the objective irreconcilability of citizen policy. After this society had diversified so much, it had become ever more powerful and rich, and and so much was connected to the world, far beyond the city walls. There were evidently new social protagonists, new families that had urbanized from land owning in the district, right? Some of them could even be modest level, city families that had grown in importance thanks to the mercantile and financial activities that were rising fast in the 13th century. Families of mixed type that practiced still, an handcraft, profession, and they, while, for example, managing land property in the district, these forces were expanding in society, and they were changing as a consequence the political frame of the commune unavoidably, right? There's no difference that the commune in which they acted had initially a aristocratic or bourgeois ruling class, because in any case the new families were counterposed to the previous oligarchy, whichever were their social characteristics and the basis of their wealth. It was a political struggle proper. And in the 13th century, just to conclude with Italy, because we already made lots of videos on the rise of the signories, we'll have to go in great detail with that, but there will be in fact time, hopefully, to talk about it on another occasion. But the 13th century was this great season of changes, to which were combined social vivacity, rationalizing tendencies, and it was a patrimony of rules, of conceptions of policy, and of institutional models that did not go lost. But at the beginning of the 14th century, single individuals, but technically since the mid-13th, but at the beginning of the 14th century were often military professionals, like chiefs of mercenary companies, and that were hired by the communes in order to fight against each other, or other families, for example, of aristocratic tradition of rural estates background. It were often the same people, right? They took over gradually the major power in the larger Italian communes, and opening to the season of so-called city lordships, right? And at this point, the cities had imposing administrative apparatuses that they could have not been eliminated, right? So, and therefore, it happened that exactly with the first steps of the city signories, when this was taking the direction of regional states, people began to become patricians, for example, because they, for example, had important functionary roles, and not because they were, and not because they became functionaries because they were already patricians. You understand what it means? So, from one side, the new absolute powers were kind of closing, obviously, the democratic and assemblary tradition of which the commune had developed itself, and there's nothing truly democratic in the way we mean it about, by the way, most like a republican character. But even in there, it's wilder than it sounds, especially before the 13th century. But yet that was a more functional system, at least from a social and political point of view. We're skipping too much. But from the other side, these powers began to using the apparatuses of the same apparatuses that an assemblary tradition had contributed to build, right? In particular, the builders of the regional states inherited from the commune in order to legitimize their own power, the republican tradition proper. Right? It doesn't matter whether it took a more monarch character, if it was maybe of popular form, but still the idea that there was a consensus, after all, that produced this new regime. In the rest of Europe, the only scansions comparable to the Italian communal evolution are to be found basically only in southern France. In some regions, such as northern France and Germany or Flanders, the markedly artisanal, like a kind of craftsman, mercantile character of the ruling classes of the communes justifies the connection, kind of commune bourgeoisie, right? These centers were probably more kind of economical, realities that didn't have much of a political military room to develop on their own, even if they accomplished sometimes imposing results, but they didn't develop the same statal structure that, for example, is to be found in Italy. Let's say in central and southern France, there are consular ruling classes of aristocratic extraction, right? Everywhere there were more or less autonomous communes. In Germany, the Freie Reichsstädte, the free cities of the empire, were the more autonomous, right? But they were fundamentally, in fact, an imperial creation, usually created in a strategical sense to counter, to check the expansion of a lord, but not because they could expand in their turn. Fundamentally, we're still under the emperor, and usually these powers were capable of subtracting themselves to the control of territorial princes for this reason. In France, instead, the cities that were under the control of the royal functionaries, the prévôts, were less autonomous than the others. We can talk about, therefore, a European communal movement, but of these communal developments, we have to underline two differences from Italy. The first one is decisive, is that every commune aimed at best at self-government within its own walls, and it didn't have ambitions to build a territorial domination. The second one is the absence of strong political changes during the 13th century. It's also because probably they weren't city-states, as we have seen properly. Right? Each one of those communes developed gradually, strongly, conditions by its origins. There could be, as we've seen, mercantile or more rarely aristocratic in the rest of Europe, without being theater, for example, of strong social changes or decisive institutional upheavals. And those communes had less ambitions to present themselves as public powers, and they were essentially worried to regulate their own coexistence with whom actually was public power at a local level, right? At least in a more credited way. It could be a bishop, a territorial prince, but sometimes even the same king, naturally, with its direct representatives that, especially if you've seen maybe in France, this was much truer than in Germany, right? While, territorial prince or a bishop in Germany was that more likely. And there are many contexts in this regard to be taken into consideration. But generally speaking, this is maybe a sketch that can help to frame the picture better. This major, this idea of unity, of a proper European civilization, but also different characters that naturally are just standing beside some other systems, right? And the Italian exception is so important because, just aside from the fact of being the most dramatically documented one of the all Middle Ages, but also being so capable of producing everything: wealth, art, law, even the sheer military resources. I mean, that was a big thing, a really big one, and that's where you don't find much of a room sometimes in that popular culture we're talking about at the beginning. But that's obviously the most central in order to understand the communal civilization that evolved, as we've seen in much else, with humanism, with the Renaissance, and modern Europe, fundamentally as we know it. So we will keep talking about all these things. It's time actually we start talking about communes all over Europe in detail, right? But I don't know how frequently we can do that. But we will try to cover that with specific examples. But for now, we just stop here, and I hope that you enjoyed this video. If you did, please share it, otherwise leave a like or subscribe to my channel if you're interested in my upcoming contents. And for now, I thank you heartily for listening to me. I wish you a nice time and see you next time. Bye.